Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into something a little colder. Imagine yourself stepping out onto a vast, blinding sheet of snow. The sky above is pale blue, nearly white at the edges, and the sun, it's not warm, not cozy. It's harsh, relentless. It reflects off every frozen surface and stabs into your eyes like 1,000 icy needles. You blink and blink, but the brightness just won't quit. This is snow blindness, nature's way of telling you that sunglasses aren't optional up here. The thing is, you're not carrying high-tech ski goggles or designer shades. You're in the Arctic, centuries ago. There are no malls, no delivery drones. You've got to work with what nature hands you, and that means bone, driftwood, and a touch of ingenuity. Oh, and you probably won't survive this, by the way. At least not without the right eyewear. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and if you're tuning in from somewhere especially chilly, or not, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you all drift off. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the tundra, boots crunching lightly over hard-packed snow, every breath crisp enough to sting your lungs. The world is white on white, snow underfoot, snow above, snow stretching out in every direction. Your eyes ache, not from cold, but from light. The sun, sitting low on the horizon, ricochets off every surface like it's got a personal grudge. This isn't just unpleasant, it's dangerous. The Inuit, who have lived here for thousands of years, know this well. Without protection, a person can go snowblind in a matter of hours. It's not permanent usually, but it's painful, and in the Arctic, being unable to see is a life-threatening issue. You can't hunt. You can't travel. You might even walk straight off a snow-covered cliff, which is a deeply uncool way to go. But how do you block the sun when you don't have glass or lenses, or really anything remotely resembling a sunglass kiosk? Well, the Inuit did what humans have always done in a pinch. They got creative. Really creative. They studied their environment, watched how snow reflected light, noticed how even squinting helped cut down the glare. Then they built on that idea literally. Out of driftwood, bone, and antler, they carved goggles. Goggles with long, narrow slits that let in just enough light to see, but not so much that it burned your retinas into jelly. The earliest goggles were rudimentary. Think, polished driftwood shaped to fit the curve of the face, with two tiny slits scraped into the front using a sharpened shard of stone. They were tied onto the head with sinew or seal gut, which, yes, sounds gross, but honestly, you'd be surprised how comfy dried intestine can be once you've softened it up. It wasn't just about protection either. These goggles enhanced focus. The narrow slits acted like a pinhole camera, sharpening the blurry shapes on the horizon. Seal-breathing hole? Clearer. Distant caribou. Easier to spot. And your cousin trying to sneak up on you during a snowball ambush? Good luck with that, buddy. Interestingly, these goggles weren't just improvised one-offs. They became tradition. Passed down, improved, customized. Some were decorated, etched with simple patterns or family markings. Some had wider slits for overcast days, others tighter for high sun glare. There was a quiet science to it all, only no one was taking notes. Just carving, testing, wearing, surviving. Modern historians estimate that Inuit snow goggles go back at least 2,000 years, possibly more. They appear in oral histories, in artifacts pulled from permafrost layers, and in the eyes of elders who still remember their grandparents making them by hand. One fun, mildly disturbing tidbit, in some groups, Children were given training goggles with slits so narrow they could barely see. Why? To train their peripheral awareness. Imagine trying to do chores with horse blinkers on. That's not just vision protection, it's ninja training. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. Historians still argue whether the design spread laterally across Arctic cultures or if it arose independently in different places. Inuit in Canada, Yupik in Alaska, Thule people before them. Some even point to similar slit-based protection found among ancient Siberian reindeer herders. Was it trade, migration, or just different groups staring at the same blinding snow and thinking, hey, this sucks, let's carve something? You pause on your snowy journey now, adjusting the imaginary goggles on your own face. The world, once a chaotic blur of light, sharpens into crisp contrasts. The shadows and snowdrifts suddenly have depth. The sky stops screaming at your eyes. It's quiet, peaceful. Even the wind seems to hush around you. And yet, there's still more to learn. Because while this first layer of Inuit eyewear is clever enough on its own, what follows is a story of experimentation, adaptation, and more than one painful sunburn. From antler refinements to spiritual superstitions, fish skin bindings to European ridicule, the humble snow goggle has traveled an unexpectedly rich journey. But for now, let the cold wind bite gently at your cheeks and your vision narrow to two calm slits. Because this is just the beginning. You blink again, or at least imagine blinking inside those bone-carved goggles. The light has settled down to something tolerable, now cool, distant, like a flashlight behind a snowbank. But there's no time to dawdle. You're not here for a leisure walk. You're on the hunt. Seal hunting, to be specific, in the deep winter months, when the sea freezes solid and land offers little more than snow-covered stones and the occasional wary fox, the Inuit turn to the sea ice for sustenance. But not just anywhere. You're scanning the flat white horizon for subtle signs. An unusual bump in the snow, a faint ring of frost, a place where the ice seems to breathe. These are igloo seal breathing holes. You kneel silently, watching, waiting. Every sound you make, every shuffle, every sniffle can spook a seal rising for air below the ice. The goggles shield your eyes, but they also focus your gaze. That narrow slit forces you to concentrate on one thing at a time. It's not unlike looking through a modern camera viewfinder. You're framing a shot. Except this one may determine whether your family eats tonight. The hunt might take hours. You could spend the entire day lying on your belly in -30 temperatures, listening for the faintest plunk of icy water moving, the soft sigh of air through a hole no wider than your fist. You rely on more than your eyes. You rely on feeling the vibrations through your elbows, pressed into the snow. And yet, without your goggles, none of this would work. You'd be snowblind by midday, even on a cloudy day. It's not just brightness you see, it's the scattering of UV rays in the snowpack. The snow reflects up to 80% of ultraviolet light. Without protection, the inner surface of your eye gets burned, leaving you with painful, teary vision and the sensation of having sand jammed under your eyelids. Fun, right? Inuit hunters knew the symptoms well. They even had a name for snow blindness, pterygium, in modern clinical terms. But among Arctic communities, it was often simply the fire in the eyes. The cure? Well, it wasn't great. It involved closing your eyes for a few days, applying animal fat to the eyelids, and if you were lucky, chewing on a bit of fermented meat while you waited it out. Honestly, better just to wear the goggles. Now, not all seal hunters were the same style. Across the Arctic, different communities developed slightly different versions depending on what resources were available. Along the coastal areas of Baffin Island, driftwood washed ashore could be carved into smooth, curved frames. In inland regions, where trees were more myth than memory, caribou antler and even bone from old kills were used instead. One especially ingenious design used walrus ivory, heavier but durable, with a pleasing polish when rubbed with a bit of blubber. Some styles curved outward to fit snugly over high cheekbones. Others had built-in overhangs to shield against glare from above. Nearly all of them had the signature slits, sometimes horizontal, sometimes vertical, depending on preference. Occasionally, hunters added a dab of soot around the eye openings to reduce peripheral reflection. Yes, ancient eye black. Modern researchers have marveled at how these early Arctic peoples grasped what physicists would call diffraction limits, how narrowing the field of light entering the eye can improve focus. Inuit didn't need a lab coat to understand this. They had snow, and eyeballs, and a desire not to go blind. Of course, like all great inventions, these goggles weren't perfect from the start. In the early days before perfect slit shapes and polished fits, hunters sometimes used makeshift versions, broad pieces of bark or leather held up like a mask, or even just squinting hard enough that their eyelashes eyes shut in two perfect little openings. It didn't always go well. There were stories, quiet, cautionary tales passed down between elders of young hunters who'd carved slits too wide and gone blind in a week, or who'd forgotten their goggles on a short walk and returned home unable to see for 2 days. The goggles weren't just helpful, they were a necessity. The making of these goggles, too, was an art, and one not taken lightly. It often began with the hunt itself. A young hunter would carve their first pair from the antler of their first caribou, or rite of passage, you could say. They'd sit beside their elder, knife in hand, learning how to shape the material to the curve of their own face. No measuring tape, no templates, just intuition, repetition, and the careful hum of knowledge passed from generation to generation. The tools? As basic as it gets. A sharp stone flake for carving, a scraping tool made from sharpened bone, maybe a bit of dried shark skin for polishing. Some used ulu knives, the same curved blades used to skin seals to shape the goggles more precisely. And always, there was sinew to tie it all together. Sometimes softened leather, sometimes even woven grass fibers, depending on where you lived. Every pair was unique. No mass production here. And that made sense. Two faces aren't one size fits all, especially when you've been living in minus 40-degree wind chill for half your life. Cheeks widen, skin thickens, and goggles needed to rest snugly without cutting circulation or fogging up with breath. Oh, and about fogging. The Inuit had a trick for that too. You breathed downward, out the side of your mouth, or through your scarf. Anything to keep the warm breath from curling up into the slits and freezing into little icy blindfolds. Yes, fogging is eternal. Even ancient people knew it was annoying. So here you are, lying low over a seal hole, wearing goggles carved by hand, trimmed with sinew, darkened with soot, and bound to your head with a twist of dried walrus gut. You're surrounded by snow, silence, and your own breath. You're not squinting. You're seeing. Seeing better. Seeing enough, and for the first time in hours, your eyes don't ache. Time stretches out like the snow beneath you, endless, quiet, almost soft. You blink slowly behind your narrow slits, watching the cold air dance just above the surface of the ice. There's a certain stillness that comes from waiting in the Arctic. A stillness that's not just about silence, but about surrender. You let the world settle around you, and you listen. Then finally, a soft, wet exhale. A seal. You tense, but just for a moment. Your body knows this rhythm. Your hand tightens around the harpoon shaft. Your breath slows to a whisper. And just as your muscles ready themselves, You think not for the first time about how much of this moment hinges on your goggles. Without them, you wouldn't be here. Not like this. But the goggles are just part of it. They're the end product of an entire worldview, a way of living where nothing is wasted, and everything is used with intention. This wasn't fashion. It wasn't flair. It was a daily relationship with the environment, where snow and ice and light and wind shaped everything. Which brings us to a curious contradiction. For all their practicality, Inuit snow goggles weren't considered utilitarian junk. They had value, sometimes even sacred value. In certain Inuit communities, particularly those in Greenland and eastern Canada, goggles were passed down between generations. A grandfather's goggles might still carry the grooves of his cheekbones, the wear from his beard, and that where those indentations was seen as a form of wisdom. You didn't just inherit the goggles. You inherited the knowledge within them. Some Inuit believed the slits themselves should be carved in specific proportions following the curve of the sun, or mimicking the eye of a spirit animal. One elder reportedly told an anthropologist that the perfect slit was no thicker than a raven's feather laid flat, not exactly a standardized unit of measurement, but you get the idea. And the materials mattered too. Bone and ivory weren't chosen at random. The bones of certain animals were thought to hold specific energies or strengths. Walrus tusk for endurance, caribou antler for agility. Occasionally, a hunter would even refuse to wear goggles made from a dishonorable kill, say, an animal taken wastefully or killed while it slept. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were widespread or highly localized. Oral traditions don't always agree, and what one family sees as sacred, another might see as simply functional. But there's enough consistency in the stories to suggest that, at least for many, goggles were more than eye protection. They were a bridge between body and landscape, between hunter and spirit world. There's also the curious case of the markings. Some Inuit snow goggles were carved with tiny patterns, dots, lines, and waves etched into the edges. At first glance, they might seem decorative, like doodles added out of boredom. But when examined more closely, these patterns often align with symbolic language used in other tools and clothing. One common design, a set of 3 short lines radiating outward, possibly representing the sun, or light, or vision itself. Some modern anthropologists propose that these markings serve both functional and spiritual roles, a way to activate the goggle's protective qualities, or to signal clan affiliation. Others suggest they were just handy grip textures. Honestly, even now, we're not sure. That's part of the fun. And if you're wondering whether women wore snow goggles, the answer is yes. While most hunting was done by men, women still needed eye protection for traveling, for fishing, for drying meat under the blinding spring sun. Their goggles tended to be smaller, sometimes even daintier, with slits carved slightly lower to account for facial differences. In some regions, women added tiny beads or leather fringe, not for aesthetics, but to wick moisture and prevent snow from gathering at the temples. In one particularly cozy historical twist, there are stories of couples carving each other's goggles, a kind of Arctic love language. Here, my dear, I noticed you've been squinting a lot. Let me whittle you a lovely pair of bone goggles from that rib we boiled last week. It's no diamond ring, but hey, romance is relative. Meanwhile, the younger generation learned by watching. Toddlers were sometimes given pretend goggles made of wood or leather miniature training tools with no slits at all, just to get used to the shape and feel. As they grew, they'd graduate to real goggles with slightly wider slits, until one day they'd carve their own. Of course, not every community followed the same path. Among the central Yupik of Alaska, snow goggles took on a slightly different form, often more mask-like, with fuller coverage across the face. Some even integrated nose guards because, yes, Sunburned nostrils are real and deeply unpleasant. You haven't lived until your nose peels from the inside out. That variation hints at something important. These weren't one-size-fits-all inventions. They were regional, adaptive, evolving. Even within a single family, designs might change year to year, depending on the shape of the wearer's face, the hardness of the material, or the sharpness of their tools. Goggles were alive, in a sense, always being improved, always being personalized, and sometimes, just sometimes, they were forgotten. Picture this: a teenage boy, full of confidence, decides he's too cool for goggles. It's a cloudy day after all. No big deal. He leaves them at home. By midday, his eyes are watering. By nightfall, he can't open them without screaming. His mother scolds him. His uncle shakes his head. His grandmother, she just laughs and hands him a fermented fish poultice. Lesson learned. Because in the Arctic, you don't mess with the sun. It may be distant, but it's got teeth. And the only thing standing between you and temporary blindness is a narrow slit in a piece of old bone. Snow crunches softly under your boots as you walk well, more like waddle across the frozen expanse. Your parka is thick, your mittens crusted with ice, and your eyelashes have started to freeze together again. But your eyes? Protected. Narrowed behind the trusty slit of your bone goggles. You're beginning to realize that these strange little eye covers aren't just about surviving, they're about seeing differently. Because now, with every step, you're learning to interpret the world through those slits. It's not darkness you're looking through. It's focus. The design of Inuit snow goggles doesn't just block light, it sharpens detail. It's like squinting at a blurry painting until suddenly the shapes emerge. Your brain starts doing the math. That low lump over there? Probably a snow-covered seal-breathing hole. That strange vertical line? A distant sled trail. It's not magic. It's optics. Modern scientists who've studied traditional Inuit goggles have confirmed that the slit reduces the amount of light reaching the eye, while also increasing depth of field, kind of like using the aperture function on a fancy camera lens. Narrow the slit, and everything gets sharper. You don't just block sunlight, you enhance clarity. So ironically, by limiting your vision, you're actually seeing more. This is especially important when navigating flat light, those cloudy, overcast days when snow and sky blur into one endless smear of white. Without contrast, your eyes struggle. You trip over ridges, misjudge distances, maybe even walk straight into the wrong patch of ice. But with goggles, you detect shadows, subtle changes, the slight sparkle of wind-crusted snow versus the matte white of powder. And again, these people figured this out centuries before the scientific method was a twinkle in Galileo's eye. They didn't need lab coats. They had field tests, generations of them. One fascinating twist in the evolution of Inuit goggles involves experimenting with the slits themselves. In some versions, the slit isn't just a straight horizontal cut, it curves slightly or flares at the edges. Some hunters preferred twin slits for each eye. Others went for a single continuous band. A few even added tiny vertical cuts to increase peripheral vision. Historians still argue whether these adjustments were purely functional or if there was cultural meaning baked in. Were wider slits a sign of youth? Did certain patterns signal a person's role in the group, like navigator, elder, or healer? We may never know. But one thing is certain, there was no single, correct way to make these goggles. It was all about what worked for your face, your eyes, your snow, and what you had on hand. Materials, as always, were dictated by environment. In Greenland, you might be working with driftwood or walrus ivory. In the central Arctic, caribou antler or seal bone. In a pinch, some families even carved goggles from frozen fish skin, though those tended to melt quickly unless treated properly. Not ideal for a full day out on the ice. When visibility got especially tricky, some hunters added soot or grease to the inner rim of the slit, darkening the edge to enhance contrast, a prehistoric version of anti-glare coating. A few even dabbed seal oil on the exterior surface to keep snow from sticking. Ingenious little touches, born of sheer necessity and a very long winter. One curious myth that floated among certain Inuit communities claimed that snow goggles didn't just protect your eyes, they trained your spirit. By wearing them, you narrowed your thoughts, focused your attention, sharpened your instincts. It wasn't just about hunting seals. It was about hunting clarity. There's a quiet power in that idea, that maybe limiting your senses doesn't dull you, it disciplines you. Like monks who close their eyes to better hear the divine, or modern people who turn off their phones to remember what silence sounds like. By filtering the world, you find its edges again. A 19th century British explorer, fresh from London and hilariously overdressed, once wrote in his journal that Inuit snow goggles were barbaric contraptions resembling miniature Venetian blinds. He didn't wear them, of course. Said they gave him a headache. 3 days later, his eyes swelled shut, and he had to be carried back to camp. He never made that mistake again. And neither do you, because once you've seen the way the world bends through a narrow slit, you don't unsee it. You learn to track a hair across fresh snow. You learn to distinguish a shadow from a shape. You learn to see with intention, not assumption. Even the act of putting the goggles on becomes ritual. You tie the sinew cord behind your head. You check the slits. You rub the inside with a bit of dry snow to clear fog. Then you walk out into the white, confident you won't miss the tiniest puff of breath from a seal or the slight depression in the snow that means fresh prints. Some elders said the goggles woke up your seeing, not in the physical sense, but in the spiritual one. You stopped looking and you started observing. There's a difference. Looking is passive. Observing is active. You choose where to direct your attention. You decide what's important, and in the Arctic, there could be the difference between dinner and nothing, between getting home and not. So next time you find yourself squinting into a bright winter day, remember this. Somewhere, hundreds of years ago, someone stood on a frozen shore, carved a slit into a strip of bone, and saw the world more clearly than most of us ever will, all with the simplest tool, a quiet little miracle, tied behind the head. Your fingers move in rhythm, now rubbing a bit of snow against the inside of the goggles to keep the slits clear, tying the strap just tight enough so the bone frame hugs your face, but not enough to pinch. You've done this every day for weeks now. Or is it months? Time stretches strangely in the Arctic. It slides around like wind-blown snow. But here's what stays constant: the gear. And today, we're talking about how those goggles weren't just for daytime hunts or long-distance travel. No, they were part of a larger system of survival, a wardrobe of function-first ingenuity, stitched together by experience and refined over generations. You're probably wearing a caribou parka right now, double layered for insulation. The fur faces inward on the inner layer and outward on the outer. It traps warm air like nothing else. On your feet, likely seal skin boots, called kamiks, lined with moss or grass to wick away sweat. And nestled between your hat and your cheeks, the goggles, you feel their familiar pressure across the bridge of your nose as the wind picks up again. Most modern folks would think these snow goggles are primitive, rough, basic. But when you wear them every day, when they become part of your face, you realize they are precision instruments. You notice the way the slit guides your vision, not just to what's ahead, but to what matters. It trims the clutter from the world, and that's the thing. The goggles aren't just a passive tool. They teach you. They train your eyes to read the snow. Yes, but also to read people. Because when everyone is bundled in the same furs and wrapped against the same cold, all that's visible is the eyes. Just a thin horizontal sliver, peeking out from behind the bone. So eye contact becomes a language. A glance becomes a sentence. Inuit societies, especially before widespread Western contact, were often described by outside anthropologists as quiet, stoic. But that's just because those outsiders weren't listening closely. In truth, conversation was constant. It just didn't always happen with words. A twitch of an eyebrow, a half blink, a shared squint toward the horizon, all visible through the slit. Even greetings adapted to the eye-focused world. A smile might go unseen under layers of fur and scarf, but a quick lift of the brows? That meant hello. That meant I see you, and there was no hiding much. You could always tell if someone had been crying, or laughing, or squinting too long into the wind without goggles. The eyes said everything. Historians still debate whether these communication styles developed as a direct result of the goggles or if the goggles simply reinforced pre-existing patterns. But the connection is hard to ignore. Tools shape culture, and goggles, small as they are, shape perception in more ways than one. There are stories, too, of children playing games involving eye reading. They'd hide behind blankets and try to guess each other's emotions by peeking through tiny holes. Call it Arctic charades. The winners were usually the quietest ones, the ones who could convey surprise or joy or mischief with just a flick of their gaze, and let's not forget storytelling. In the long, dark winters, families gathered in the flickering light of soapstone lamps. The elder would begin a story, voice low and rhythmic, but it wasn't just the words that mattered. It was the eyes, wide for suspense, narrowed for mischief, darting left or right as the story moved across the landscape of the imagination. And the children, snuggled in fur, would sit entranced, their own eyes peeking out behind their goggles, absorbing not just the tale, but how to tell one. There's something beautifully intimate about a culture that centers the eyes. In a world where your face is mostly hidden, where words can freeze on the air, the gaze becomes sacred, intentional. You don't waste it. You might think of goggles as a barrier, but for the Inuit, they were a lens, a narrowing that expanded everything else, even among close-knit communities. Certain styles of goggles became recognizable like signatures. A particularly narrow slit might be associated with a skilled hunter. A broader curve with an elder who carved them that way after cataracts made precision difficult. Over time, a person's goggles became part of their identity, their silhouette. In a way, it's no different from how we recognize someone by the curve of their glasses frame or the shape of their sunglasses. But here, it's not fashion. It's function, etched with story. Sometimes when a hunter passed away, their goggles were placed on their body or left with their tools returned to the landscape. Not always. Not in every community. But often enough to be remembered. And what about when the goggles broke? You didn't toss them. You repaired them. With sinew thread. With softened bone glue. With the careful attention of someone who knows that a cracked slit can be the difference between tracking a seal and walking into open water. One wrong glare, and the white world swallows you whole. So the act of repair wasn't just technical. It was tender, reverent. Fixing goggles was a way of respecting the visibility they'd given you, and every repaired pair gained new layers of memory. That nick on the edge, from the sled tipping near the ice ridge, that small crack, from when your son borrowed them on his first solo trip. They aged like stories. Goggles weren't static. They grew with the wearer, they whispered. You saw this. You lived this. You endured, and so do you. Your breath hangs in the air, soft clouds that dissolve into the endless white. You shift your weight on the hard-packed snow, boots creaking slightly, and the wind flutters the edge of your parka hood. Through your slit goggles, the horizon is a ribbon of light. Pale blue meets snow silver. Somewhere out there, beyond what you can see, is the seal you've been tracking since morning. But don't worry, you've got time. You're not just hunting. You're participating in something deeper. A rhythm, a cycle, a ritual of watching and waiting that predates the written word. This section, it's about how snow goggles shape the hunt, not just physically, but mentally. Because when you wear them long enough, you notice something odd. They don't just shield your eyes. They alter how you think. The world narrows. Your focus sharpens. You move differently, slower, more intentionally. You stop scanning everything at once and start zeroing in. A puff of snow near that ice ridge. Could be wind. Could be breath. Either way, you wouldn't have noticed it if your vision were flooded with glare. Snow goggles teach patience. Not the meditative kind with incense and chanting, but the gritted teeth, knee-numbing, sit in the snow for hours kind. You can't rush the Arctic. It moves on its own schedule. Hunters would sometimes wait all day near a seal hole, motionless, eyes narrowed behind their goggles, watching for a whisker twitch or a ripple in the snow. And the moment that seal surfaced, you needed perfect timing, no squinting, no adjusting your eyes. Just swift, quiet action. Historians still argue whether the rise of slit-style goggles coincided with a broader shift in hunting strategies. Some say the technology allowed for more daytime hunting, while others believe the goggles emerged because hunting was already moving toward longer, slower pursuits that required laser focus. Either way, the impact was the same: survival through stillness, and when you're still, you start noticing details. Like how sunlight bounces off snow at different angles, depending on the time of day. Or how distant ice glows blue when it's old and thick. Or how a puffin feather, stuck in the snow, means open water isn't far off. You wouldn't catch that with your eyes watering from glare. And speaking of the sun, it's not just brightness you're shielding from. It's ultraviolet radiation. Snow reflects UV light so efficiently that Arctic travelers can burn their corneas even on cloudy days. It's called photokeratitis, or snow blindness. It's not pretty. Feels like sand in your eyes and can last 4 days. So yeah, you could go without goggles. But only if you're also into temporary blindness and weeping uncontrollably while trying to find your igloo. One 18th century missionary in Labrador wrote about how local Inuit strapped peculiar slats to their faces, obscuring their vision like monks in penance. He didn't wear goggles either. You can probably guess what happened to his vision. There's even an Inuit legend about a hunter who lost his goggles to a mischievous raven. The story goes that the raven stole them right off the man's face while he napped near the shore. When he woke, the world was pain. He stumbled back to camp, eyes burning, unable to see the path. Ever since, children are told to guard their goggles carefully and to beware the raven's laugh. These stories weren't just entertaining. They taught practical lessons in disguise, and the practical was sacred. You see, in the Arctic, even the smallest edge could mean life or death. The difference between catching dinner and going hungry, between making it home and wandering into a whiteout. You see, in the Arctic, even the smallest edge could mean life or death. The difference between catching dinner and going hungry, between making it home and wandering into a whiteout. Even today, Inuit hunters continue to use traditional goggles in some regions, often alongside modern gear. Not because they reject new technology, but because some old ideas still work better. Lighter, simpler, easier to fix in the field. You don't need a battery. You need bone and skill. In fact, some modern outdoor survivalists and winter athletes have begun experimenting with slit goggles again, especially those exploring minimalist gear. One climber swore they reduced his headaches during a polar expedition. Another said it made him feel like he was looking through purpose. And honestly, he's not wrong. There's something profound about choosing to limit what you see in order to understand more. It's the paradox of focus. Less input, more clarity back to your hunt. Your eyes sweep across the snow again. Still nothing. But you're not bored. Not even close. Because this kind of waiting, eyes shielded, mind still, is its own kind of meditation. And in that stillness, you notice something, a tiny plume of snow. Just to the left. Almost invisible. You don't move. You barely breathe, just watch. Through the slit. Through centuries of knowledge, carved into a piece of bone and weight. You don't remember exactly when you started trusting your instincts this much. Maybe it was the first time you tracked a seal for hours and actually caught it. Maybe it was the day you outwaited a blizzard, goggles frosting over, and still found your way home. Or maybe it's just always been like this. One snow-covered day blurring into another, slowly teaching you how to think like the land, but trust. That's what this next part is about. Because goggles, oddly enough, are about belief. Not just in what they help you see, but in the generations of trial and error that shape them. Every curve, every notch, every precisely carved slit holds ancestral knowledge. These weren't weekend craft projects. These were the result of endless tweaking by people who had to get it exactly right, or not come back. You picture your grandfather now, hunched over a whale rib, scraping it with a stone flake to shape the frame. Not because he wanted to make art, but because your cousin needed a new pair after losing his in a sled accident. Functional love, carved and smoothed and worn. Most Inuit goggles were custom fit. They had to be. Every face is different, and a gap, even the tiniest one, lets in light that can blind you. So the bone is heated gently, just enough to flex, and then pressed against the forehead and cheeks to take shape. It cools quickly in the Arctic air. The result? A snug, tailored fit with no daylight sneaking through. Historians still argue whether these precise fitting methods were passed through formal teaching, like apprenticeships, or simply learned through imitation. Was there a designated goggle maker in each group? Or did every adult learn the craft in case of emergency? The written record doesn't say, but the goggles themselves do. They whisper of many hands, many faces. Sometimes you'll see goggles that still bear fingerprints in the sinew binding. Little dents where someone pressed too hard, or maybe was interrupted mid-build by a howling dog or a collapsing ice shelf. Life didn't pause for gear making. It wove around it. And while most goggles were made of bone or driftwood, others came from antler, ivory, even baleen, the flexible material from a whale's mouth. Each had different properties. Bone was light but brittle. Driftwood was softer, easier to shape. Ivory, smooth, durable, elegant. It lasted decades if cared for properly. You've probably seen at least one ceremonial pair polished, inlaid with tiny beads or a strip of dark fur. Not for everyday use. These were worn during festivals or rituals, sometimes passed down like heirlooms. They looked almost futuristic. Clean lines, minimalist elegance. You can imagine them in a museum display with dramatic lighting and a plaque that gets half the facts wrong. But the everyday goggles? They were humble. A little chipped. A little worn at the edges. Held together with sinew and salt and care. One traveler in the early 20th century described a moment when an Inuit guide lent him his goggles during a crossing. The guide said nothing, just placed them in the traveler's hands and pointed forward. The man put them on, and for the first time, he saw the snow clearly. Not just blinding white, but texture, movement, depth. And the strangest part, it wasn't a revelation. It was a reduction. Like turning down the volume and realizing you can finally hear your own heartbeat. There's even speculation that the slits in Inuit goggles functioned like pinhole cameras. Narrowing the light increases the depth of field, letting you see sharper, crisper images without needing a lens. It's optics, centuries before physics textbooks. Vision as craft. And this clarity, this sharpness changed how people moved through the world. Hunters followed tiny depressions in the snow that others missed. Sled drivers avoided hairline cracks in sea ice that would have swallowed a careless traveler. Children learned to identify tracks by snow displacement alone. All through a pair of slits, hand-carved in bone. But there's more. Because when you wear goggles long enough, your brain starts to adjust. Scientists today call it neuroplasticity, the idea that your mind reshapes itself based on experience. Inuit hunters wouldn't have used that word, but they understood the effect. You think differently when your vision is narrowed. You become more aware of motion, of shadow, of the weight of a cloud passing over the sun. And over time, you stop needing to see everything. You start trusting the land, trusting what's around the corner even when you can't see it. You, right now, standing on the snow-covered ridge with the goggles pressed to your face, this is trust in action. You don't flinch at the cracking ice in the distance. You don't rush your steps. You move steady, deliberate, just like the ones who walked this path before you. And in the distance, the wind shifts. You squint slightly and spot the movement again. That same patch of snow, puffing just a bit. There's something there. You know it, not because you can see it clearly, but because you've learned how to read between the slits. You're getting used to the slow rhythm now, the steady inhale and exhale of the Arctic breathing around you. The sound of your boots crunching on snow, muffled by the soft padding beneath, almost hypnotic. Your goggles press lightly against your skin, blocking the sun's glare, but also creating a cozy little world just for your eyes. This section explores how Inuit goggles influence daily life beyond hunting, from travel to social interactions, and how this simple tool became essential to survival in subtle ways you might not expect. Picture a group of travelers setting off across the ice. They're not just hunters. They're family, neighbors, sometimes entire communities moving together. The goggles aren't merely eye protection. They become part of their identity, their unspoken language. How you wear them, the shape, the decorations, these quietly signal where you're from, your clan, or even your role in the group. You might notice a father adjusting his child's goggles carefully before they start the trek. Teaching the next generation how to protect their eyes is a rite of passage. Because losing your goggles out on the ice isn't just an inconvenience. It could mean blindness for days, maybe longer, if untreated. And there's more than just physical protection here. Inuit goggles also shaped social behavior, and even fashion in subtle ways. Historians still argue how much ornamentation was purely practical versus symbolic. Some goggles are adorned with carvings or dyed with natural pigments, while others remain stark and utilitarian. You could almost think of them as the original wearable tech, a blend of function and style. Imagine the awkward moment when you first put on your goggles. You're a kid learning to hunt or travel with your family. The world looks a bit different through those narrow slits, compressed and simplified. It takes practice to navigate, especially when everything you've known before was wide open. Older Inuit told stories about how new hunters had to see the world through the bone. It was a metaphor for learning to focus on what matters, filtering out distractions a skill as important in the wild as in daily life. Traveling long distances in the Arctic was grueling. The wind cuts through clothes like a knife, and the sun reflecting off snow blinds you. Without goggles, even short journeys could become dangerous. Travelers relied on their goggles to avoid snow blindness, but also to read subtle signs in the environment, like the glimmer of thin ice or the shadow of a crevice hidden beneath snow. One explorer who journeyed with the Inuit remarked how his own Western goggles fogged up and shattered in the cold, while the bone slits remained clear, functional, and comfortable. He quickly realized that this primitive gear was designed exactly for this environment, refined over generations. Even today, when you see modern skiers or explorers wearing specialized eyewear, many features like the snug fit and minimal glare trace back to these ancient designs. There's also a quieter story here about how people adapted to extreme conditions, not just through brute strength, but through subtle tools and shared wisdom. Inuit goggles remind you that sometimes survival means narrowing your world just enough to see it more clearly. You might think goggles are only about sight, but they're also about sound, or rather, about how sound and vision work together when you're navigating the Arctic. Imagine standing still in the biting cold, the snow around you whispering underfoot. Your breath puffs out in soft clouds. The goggles cut the light, but your ears sharpen. This section explores how the visual narrowing of goggles influences how hunters listen and move, blending senses to master a landscape that's as much heard as seen. Hunters often relied on subtle sounds to track prey, the faint splash of a seal surfacing, the distant crack of ice shifting, even the barely audible rustle of a bird taking flight. When your vision is constricted by the narrow slits, your brain compensates by heightening your other senses. Historians still argue whether this sensory shift was a conscious adaptation or an incidental byproduct of using goggles. Either way, it shaped how hunters moved slowly, attentively, blending silence with observation. One elder described it like this: when you wear the bone goggles, the world quiets, and you listen more with your eyes and see more with your ears. That may sound poetic, but it's surprisingly practical. The Arctic is a place where distraction can be deadly. You learn to coordinate every sense in delicate harmony. Your footsteps become deliberate. You tune your ears to the rhythm of the wind, the creak of the ice beneath, and the quiet thud of distant waves against the shore. This sensory blending helps you detect movement beyond the narrow field of your vision. A sharp crack might mean shifting ice, warning you to pause. A distant splash could signal your prey, and here's a fun bit. Some goggles had tiny notches carved near the slits, which may have helped hunters angle their gaze or even catch a bit of peripheral movement without exposing their eyes to glare. It's like having a built-in, ancient heads-up display, just bone and light, sound and sight combined to guide every step, every breath, every decision. You realize that the goggles aren't just about blocking light. They're about shaping perception, teaching you how to be present in a harsh world. By narrowing what you see, they open up what you sense. So next time you think about these simple tools, remember they're not just historical curiosities. They're part of a finely tuned survival strategy that blends science, art, and experience. And as you stand there, feeling the wind, the snow, the cold, you become part of that long lineage of watchers, listeners, and travelers. You're beginning to notice the subtle differences in the goggles themselves. Some are smaller, others larger, some with wide slits, others barely letting in a thread of light. These variations tell a story about regional climate, cultural preferences, and available materials. This section dives into how geography shaped the design of Inuit goggles across the Arctic, revealing surprising diversity that might not be obvious at first glance. For instance, in the western Arctic, where the sun's reflection off sea ice is intense and prolonged, goggles tended to have narrower slits to block out the harshest glare. Over in the eastern regions, where cloud cover was more common and the light softer, Slits might be wider, allowing more visibility at the expense of some protection. Historians still debate whether these differences were purely environmental adaptations or also linked to cultural identity and trade. Some communities prized certain styles, decorating their goggles with unique carvings or fur trims to distinguish themselves. You might picture an elder in Alaska comparing his goggles to those made hundreds of miles away in Greenland. Each pair tells a story of place, weather, and tradition. And there's also the matter of materials. Driftwood is scarce in some parts, so bone from seals, walrus, or whales became the primary source. In other areas, antler was preferred for its sturdiness, though it was heavier and harder to shape. You can almost hear the debate at a communal gathering. No, the antler ones last longer, but the driftwood lets in less cold. These preferences were as much about pride as practicality. Interestingly, some goggles show signs of repair, tiny holes drilled to reattach broken straps, or patches of sinew reinforcing cracked bone. These details show how valued these items were. They were too important to toss away, and it wasn't just the shape or material. The way goggles were worn varied too. Some people wrapped fur around the edges to create a seal against the skin, preventing frostbite. Others left the edges bare for better ventilation. You start to appreciate how these small choices made big differences in comfort and survival. In this vast frozen landscape, where a misstep could be fatal, the right pair of goggles was more than gear, it was a lifeline. Your journey now isn't just about understanding an object, but the people who crafted it, how they adapted, traded, and cared for one another through the centuries. So, next time you see a pair of ancient goggles, remember they're a map of the Arctic itself, carved in bone and sinew. You've been walking through this story for a while now, and maybe you're starting to realize that goggles weren't just about protecting eyes. They were also about coping with the extreme mental challenges of Arctic life. This section explores how the goggles became a symbol of resilience and mental focus, helping Inuit people maintain calm and concentration during long, isolating winters. Imagine the endless twilight of the Arctic winter, when the sun barely rises, and the world seems frozen in a quiet, bluish gloom. Your goggles aren't just shielding your eyes from light, they're helping you shield your mind from overwhelm. Wearing goggles with narrow slits forces you to slow down, to look carefully, and to focus on small details. This deliberate way of seeing can calm a restless mind. Instead of chaos, there's order, a controlled, limited view that helps you stay grounded. Elders often spoke of seeing through the bone as a meditative practice. The physical act of narrowing your vision parallels the mental act of narrowing your thoughts, filtering out distractions, and finding clarity. Historians still debate whether this practice was a formal part of Inuit training or an informal byproduct of survival skills. Either way, the calming effect is clear. Some contemporary psychologists studying mindfulness point out that restricting visual input can help the brain enter a relaxed state. Inuit goggles may have offered a natural form of this long before mindfulness entered Western culture. And here's a gentle irony. Something designed to protect you from physical harm also protected your mental well-being. Long hunting trips could be lonely and tense. The wind howled, the cold bit, and danger lurked everywhere. But the goggles created a small, safe bubble around your face, a place where you could focus, breathe, and steady yourself. You can imagine young hunters learning this lesson from their parents, passing it down with quiet words and patient example. It's also why many Inuit stories describe the land and sky as living, breathing entities, because the goggles help you see the subtle signs that reveal their moods. So, when you put on your own imaginary pair, you're not just joining a practical tradition, you're entering a mindset shaped by centuries of experience, patience, and quiet strength. And as you wear them, you might just find your own thoughts slowing, settling, becoming as calm and steady as the Arctic itself. You're now deep into the story, and it's time to explore a surprising chapter: how Inuit goggles influenced explorers and outsiders who came to the Arctic. This section reveals how early European explorers, faced with snow blindness and harsh conditions, adopted Inuit designs, transforming their own survival gear in unexpected ways. Picture an explorer stepping out onto the ice for the first time. His fancy leather goggles or tinted glasses fog up instantly. The blinding glare of the sun reflects off the snow, and he's quickly in trouble. Meanwhile, Inuit guides calmly adjust their bone goggles and continue as if nothing is amiss. These explorers quickly notice that the native gear works better for Arctic conditions. Historians still argue how much credit Inuit designs received in European journals, as sometimes explorers downplayed indigenous knowledge in favor of their own discoveries. Yet, it's undeniable that Inuit ingenuity shaped the evolution of Arctic eyewear. Some expeditions even brought back bone goggles as specimens, curious about how they worked. You can imagine a scene in a dimly lit camp, explorers awkwardly trying on goggles carved from walrus tusk, marveling at their effectiveness. Over time, Europeans began incorporating features inspired by Inuit goggles' narrow slits, snug fits, and materials chosen for insulation. This exchange wasn't one way either. Inuit people started experimenting with new materials and trade goods brought by outsiders, mixing tradition with innovation. For example, some goggles were reinforced with leather straps from European supplies or decorated with traded beads. This blending of cultures highlights how technology adapts and evolves through contact and necessity. Even today, modern snow goggles owe a debt to these ancient designs, proving that sometimes the best inventions come from lived experience, not laboratories. So as you drift off, consider this. Your sleep tonight owes a little gratitude to those bone goggles and the ingenuity. They represent a quiet legacy of collaboration and survival. You've learned about the practicality and cultural significance of Inuit goggles, but now let's take a moment to appreciate the artistry behind their creation. This section uncovers the craftsmanship involved, how each pair was carefully carved, shaped, and polished by hand, turning simple bone into functional art. Imagine an artisan sitting by a flickering fire, holding a piece of walrus tusk. The bone feels cold but solid under their fingers. With steady hands and simple tools like stone blades or scrapers, they begin the delicate process of shaping. The narrow slits are cut with precision, because if they're too wide, the goggles won't protect properly. But if too narrow, they limit vision excessively. It's a balance honed over generations. Polishing the bone to a smooth finish was essential not just for comfort, but to reduce glare and prevent irritation. This step could take hours, using abrasive stones or even sand mixed with water. Some artisans decorated the edges with small incisions or carved patterns, lines, dots, or symbolic shapes reflecting their community or spiritual beliefs. Sometimes they incorporated small inlays of ivory or stone. Historians still debate the exact meanings of some patterns, but it's clear these designs added a personal and cultural touch to an otherwise utilitarian object. The process also required patience and respect for the materials. Bone was a precious resource, and nothing went to waste. Scraps might be used for tools or small ornaments. You can almost hear the artisan's quiet concentration, the steady rasping of the blade, and the occasional crackle of the fire. Crafting goggles was more than a task. It was an act of care, connection, and tradition. These handmade objects carry the fingerprints of their makers and the history of their people. As you imagine this scene, it's a reminder that even the most practical items can hold beauty and meaning, slowly revealed through time and touch. By now, you're feeling the steady pulse of this ancient world, how every detail, every choice, is woven into survival and story. This section explores the rituals and beliefs tied to goggles, revealing how these practical tools also carried spiritual weight. Imagine a young hunter preparing for his first solo journey. His family gathers tubeless as goggles, believing the carved bone can carry protective spirits. Inuit spirituality often intertwines the physical and the mystical. Objects like goggles weren't just shields against sunlight, but talismans against unseen dangers. Some communities believed the bone could capture the power of the animal it came from: seal, walrus, or whale, offering strength or guidance. Historians still debate the extent to which these beliefs influenced daily use, but oral traditions speak clearly about the sacredness of such items. Stories describe shamans performing rituals to awaken the goggles, invoking protection and clarity. This spiritual aspect added a layer of comfort and confidence, essential when facing the harsh and unpredictable Arctic environment. You might imagine the quiet moment when a hunter slides on his goggles before dawn, feeling not just physical readiness, but a connection to ancestors and nature's spirits. It's a reminder that in many cultures, survival blends science and spirit, logic and belief, and as the Arctic night falls softly, the goggles' simple bones carved by patient hands become more than tools. They become companions on a journey of endurance, faith, and quiet strength. You've traveled through time and tundra, learning how a simple pair of bone goggles shaped lives, senses, and stories in the Arctic. Now, in this final section, you'll discover how modern people keep this tradition alive, whether in museums, art, or renewed cultural pride. Today, Inuit artisans still carve bone goggles, honoring their ancestors and educating new generations. These pieces aren't just relics but living symbols connecting past and present. Some museums display ancient goggles alongside contemporary ones, showing how designs have evolved, but the essence remains. Visitors often comment on the elegance and practicality they embody. Historians still debate how best to preserve and present these items respectfully, balancing scientific study with cultural sensitivity. Communities host workshops where elders teach young people carving skills, sharing stories embedded in each groove and slit. This revival is about more than preservation. It's about identity and resilience, reminding everyone that innovation comes from deep roots and lived experience. And in some unexpected ways, these ancient designs inspire modern fashion and outdoor gear, proof that good ideas endure. So, as you settle into sleep, remember this journey. You've walked with hunters, artisans, and storytellers through frozen landscapes, feeling the cool touch of bone and wind. The goggles are more than tools, they're a bridge between worlds, a whisper of history you carry with you. May this story leave you calm and curious, wrapped in the quiet strength of the Arctic night. Now, as the story slows, feel your breath deepen and your thoughts soften. Imagine the vast, silent expanse of snow stretching out under a pale sky, where the only sound is the gentle whisper of wind across frozen ice. The bone goggles rest lightly on your face, their smooth curves cool against your skin, filtering out harsh light and noise. Your mind drifts with the slow rhythm of ancient rhythms, finding peace in the steady dance of shadow and glow. Let your body relax, sinking deeper into the warmth of your bed as the Arctic night carries you softly toward rest. Here, in this quiet moment, you're part of a long, unbroken chain of watchful eyes and steady hearts. Sleep well, wrapped in the calm embrace of history and of script. Sweet dreams.